Gyrish Talk. We are back for season 4 of the Gyrish Talk podcast. Reminder on the show, Notre Dame football, we're heavy on the data analytics. We are light on the hot takes, although I think I'm probably getting spicier and spicier here with each new season. And glass half full, we try to be super positive fans on Notre Dame football, especially as it relates to the players. Always try to come at it from a positive angle. And welcoming my co-host, Mike, to the show. Mike, welcome back, season 4. Good to see you again, man.
Great to be back. It's these long layovers when football season ends. I think you realize how much you miss it, especially when you get into the dog days of summer. And yeah, man, it's a great feeling that we're now. I guess there's an actual real game of college football this next Saturday, and then we're 2 weeks out. Recording right now, we're 2 weeks out from Notre Dame versus Texas A&M. So yeah, I'm psyched. I feel like I just love our group text, just talking football 24/7. I was out to dinner with my wife a few days ago, and she saw preseason NFL football on the screen. And she looked at me, and her reaction was like,
Back,
"Oh
baby.
no, oh no, we have football every week now until basically Valentine's Day." So
Amazing.
Great news for me. Not great news for many wives and significant others out there.
Exactly. Well, we've got really big news for Gyrish Nation. We are dipping our toes into new territory. I'm pretty nervous about this, and we are admittedly figuring it out on the fly with about an hour of prep going into this. But we are going to venture into the world of video podcasting. We've got a Gyrish Talk YouTube channel up and running, currently with 0 videos on it, Mike. I have no clue how this is going to go. And I've always been told we have great faces for podcasting by our friends. So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work out. But if you're watching this on YouTube, very first time, Mike and I have been on YouTube, very first time Gyrish Talk has moved off of the traditional audio podcast. We're, of course, still there. You can go find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, wherever you get your podcasts. We're there. Go find us. But Mike, pretty excited here to move into a new platform for the show.
Yeah, dude, we're finally out of the Stone Age. Yeah, even my technology. I was talking to Brett about this before we started recording. I was using this super old laptop from like 10 years ago. Thing was basically a brick. I had this really, really janky setup. I was recording our conversation on my phone via Zoom. I'd have this old laptop that actually was recording via Audacity, and then I had my work laptop where I would pull up data. So I finally got a new Mac laptop, and I can do this all through one computer. And then now we have the updated, audio and video technology with the video. So we'll see, Brett. I mean, like you said, we have great faces for audio. We'll see how this works with video. If I have a bad hair day, I might have to put a hat on. We'll see. I'm gonna have to.
I got my Grateful Dead hat. I got my Denko hat on for that very reason.
Yeah, we can invest in some makeup. Look. Makeup, professional makeup.
It's in the budget. It's in the budget.
Exactly. It can do wonders. So we'll see. We'll see if that's necessary or not.
Well, I'm very excited about this white wall background that I have for our listeners. I promise I have a lot of Notre Dame memorabilia in the house. I got to figure out how to get that into the background here, get one of those nice looking sports offices instead of our, nice blank background in here. But I got my throw the damn ball Notre Dame shirt on today. I'm excited for Riley Leonard and Den Burrock to throw that on. So I've got that going. And if you're watching, I have my Drink Wisconsin Boy beer with shout out to my in-laws. Best birthday present I got this summer was a case of beer, Spotted Cow, shipped in directly from Wisconsin. So thank you, Tom and Betsy, for the birthday gift. Got that ready to go for the show. In terms of what we're doing today, we have a marathon recording 5 episodes in a row. We'll, of course, break them up so you don't have to, listen to every show all at once. But we're going to be covering all things season preview. We've got transfers on the docket today, figure in who's out, who's out, who are the new faces, who are the players we've lost. And then we're going to dive through offense, defense, a recruiting update, and look ahead to the 2024 schedule. So full slate of August content for our Notre Dame listeners. We're going to try to start getting this pushed out here as quickly as possible. We're recording this on Sunday, August 18th. So if you're getting one of these episodes a week or so later and we miss injury news or, we miss a coaching update or anything coming out of summer camp, might have a little bit of a lag there, but been doing a lot of research the last few weeks and excited to dive in. Mike, you ready to go?
Never been more ready. Let's do it.
All right, we're going to talk transfers today, and before we get in, I'm going to start with I mentioned my takes are maybe getting a little hotter and hotter the more we've sat in front of a microphone these last 4 years, and the transfer world. I think Mike, you and I are pretty united on the front that we think this is great for the student athletes. We think it's great they get to monetize on their name, image, and likeness. They don't get stuck when a coach quits, but the player can't leave because, coaches don't have transfer restrictions, but players used to. And it's like, we think this is all very positive for players. It's hard as a fan. I mean, there's some teams out there with 35 plus transfers in and out, or a team like Alabama contending for a title. Saban retires, DeBoer's in, Caleb DeBoer, and they've got like 30 plus new players coming in and out. It's just like, how do you follow that as a fan? It's hard for us being on the analytics side. Poor Mike and Brett. Everyone should, be really upset about our feelings. But we're, analytically based guys, and metrics like returning production just don't matter as much anymore, right? Does it really matter how many starters you have coming back if you've got 20 transfers coming in? If you look at, are more transfers coming in a bad sign of the program? Maybe, but you go look at a team like Texas A&M, and they brought in 5 guys from Alabama, Florida State brought in 5 guys from Alabama. That's probably 5 upgrades at Florida State, right? Like, those are probably 5 4 and 5-star recruits that maybe just couldn't break through the depth chart at Alabama, but are going to be great upgrades to what was on the Florida State roster. It's so much more now where the data and the numbers, especially in the offseason, have got to be more about context and narrative and not about predictive value. Looking at things like we used to always talk about blue chip ratio. What percentage of the players on your roster are 4 and 5-star recruits? Well, that just is different now because, was it a 4 and 5-star recruit that couldn't win the starting job at Alabama? Like, are they actually really a 4-star recruit, or are they a 4-star bust? All of those things now is context and narrative, but maybe not fully explaining it, and definitely not fully predicting. You can't just look at returning production and say, man, Stanford's going to have a huge jump up this year. They're 7th in returning production. 10 years ago, that would have been a great metric to know. This year, I don't know. The guys they're bringing back kind of stunk last year. And so we're starting with transfers to level set on who's in, who's out, where's the roster at. It's such a big part of the offseason that you can't go talk about our offense and defense without first knowing about the transfers coming in, going out. But I also think it's important to level set that we're going to do our best to not try to use data in the offseason to maybe make predictions or make a bunch of explanations to where we were several years ago, because it's just such a different world. It's so new. This is really the second or third cycle now where this is, really become such a big part of college football, where the data is still evolving, the tracking still evolving, like Pro Football Focus is trying to catch up. And so we're going to do our best to level set the fans, but also know you kind of got to watch football in September to figure out where these teams are.
Totally. Yeah, Brett, I think those are great points. I think we're getting better at trying to make sense of this transfer portal and how it impacts teams. 24/7, for instance, they have transfer portal recruiting rankings, right? So I think that's helpful, but it's definitely not as precise as we would like. So I'll use Florida State from last year as an example. That was a team that was largely built from the transfer portal. And I think going into the season, Brett, I remember we had conversations about this last year. I think for me, I could have seen that team going either way. I could have seen them being a total bust just because there's so much volatility when you have that many transfers coming in, or as what actually happened, they actually hit really well on a lot of these transfers. A lot of them were essentially home runs, and they were extremely good. Went undefeated, missed the playoff, very controversial element from last year. But they were in many ways they were built from the transfer portal. But I don't know that it was something that you could have necessarily pinpointed with accuracy coming into last year. It's certainly something that was on the table, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know many people that would have been like, oh yeah, I feel for sure certain that they're going to be a top team in all of college football next year.
Absolutely. And getting a little more into it, I've started trying to put transfer teams into a couple different tiers. And you can maybe do this a couple different ways. The teams that really rely on the transfer portal, the Florida States of the world, the Texas A&Ms of the world, and then the teams that just won't touch it, like Clemson just won't take a transfer still, and Notre Dame maybe a little closer to a Clemson than we are a Florida State, but keep in mind, this is 3 straight starting quarterbacks for Notre Dame, and Jack Cohn, Sam Hartman, and now Riley Leonard. That'll be our starting quarterbacks out of the transfer portal. So we've very much moved towards being more active in the portal. But then of the teams that are active, I think there's the teams that are gutted. Like their program is just completely wiped out by transfers every year. I think of a lot of the kind of lower tier, the Kansas of the world, the lower tier Power Five conference that whenever Kansas gets a star, they're gone. Like that team, that top running back, that top quarterback, that top whoever at Kansas, they're going to go take that money at Texas or Alabama or Notre Dame or Georgia. Those teams that are just doing everything they can to not get gutted. Then there's the swappers. I'll put Colorado in this example, kind of that same middle level tier, but they are going out and they're bringing in as many players as they're taking out, and largely, doing it not necessarily to go and get amazing talent upgrades, but probably similar level. They're in the swappers. And then I'll use the poachers. And that's where, sure, you're losing players. Sure, we got guys that leave, guys that might have maybe been role players or guys that maybe couldn't have gotten through our depth chart, but they definitely weren't going to be impact players. And we're, losing them, okay, but we're instead poaching Riley Leonard, the best quarterback in the transfer portal, instant impact starter. We're bringing in a guy like RJ Oben, who's going to be a day one starter on the edge. And very likely, if I had to predict who's going to be our sacks leader this year, it's RJ Oben. Like, we're not just kind of swapping out the middle of the, roster, talent in, talent out. We are going out and losing guys that probably weren't going to start here and bringing in big impact players like, last year, Sam Hartman or Jean Baptiste. Like, we're going out and getting big time guys that are going to contribute and make an impact. I put Notre Dame in that poaching bucket. I also think Notre Dame has now very thoughtfully used NIL with the super seniors. Still out of COVID, we got some 6th-year seniors, although as we start lapping COVID, looking more like your traditional 5th-year grad senior who, frankly, was debating either, being an NIL deal at Notre Dame or maybe not getting drafted, maybe being drafted in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, maybe being an undrafted free agent. Look, an undrafted free agent in the NFL, if they even make the practice squad, which is a big question. You can go through a preseason camp, not make the 53-man roster, and also not get signed to a practice squad. But if you're, Jack Cohn for 1 year was signed to a practice squad, never really broke through, he made $225K. Like, that's what a practice squad player makes. If you're a late round choice or like a late round draft pick, you could be making $700,000 a year. Well, that's still on the table a year from now for a lot of these guys. But if you could go and get $400,000, $500,000 from a Notre Dame to stay a 5th year, maybe improve that draft stock, maybe move up to a 3rd, 4th round pick. Or if you just stay the same player for another year, okay, great. You're still that late round pick later, but hey, you had another year to make $500,000 at Notre Dame. Will you do it? Of course, the money's not out there, but that's Xavier Watts, Jack Kaiser, Howard Cross, Riley Mills, probably 4 of our best 5 or 6 defensive players, probably 4 of our top 10 guys on the roster. Like, if we are talking about Notre Dame in a playoff, it is Howard Cross, Riley Mills, Kaiser, Xavier Watts. And if we didn't have those 4 guys, and instead they'd be, 5th, 6th, or 7th round draft picks, this defense, we're having a very different conversation. So we're going to mostly be focused on the transfers. I do think it's important to keep in mind the guys we brought back with that NIL money. We're maybe not spending it on the 5-star high school recruit. We're spending it on a proven, above average, borderline college All-Americans that just might not be that top 1st, 2nd, 3rd round draft pick in the NFL. But gosh, they're worth a lot of money to Notre Dame. They're worth a lot of wins to Notre Dame. Let's go use our NIL money there. I think it's been a really smart strategy. Something Marcus Freeman is, I think, done as good of a job as we've seen in the country of retaining the guys we want back on the roster.
Absolutely. I think, Brett, I think you hit the nail on the head right here. So I think if I'm looking at how Marcus Freeman has really leaned into certain elements that are taking over the current college football landscape, you got to start with the transfer portal and NIL. And as you just mentioned, I think from a transfer portal standpoint, we've been able to fill a lot of gaps and a lot of holes. Maybe we're not being as effective as Ohio State, but I would argue there's really no one who's being as effective as Ohio State is. But I think we're firmly in that upper crust. It has clearly been a net positive for us. We're clearly getting, and we're going to go into this a little bit more on the specifics of everyone that we got this year. But I think we're clearly getting impact players from the transfer portal. And then you couple that, like you said, with NIL, where we're convincing these high, maybe not first round draft pick, but high impact veteran players to stick around. And again, that just adds a lot of certainty to how the team's going to perform. It adds a veteran presence. And of course, these two elements are intertwined. You're going to do better in the transfer portal if you have a strong NIL component. So I think that's one element that makes me very bullish on Marcus Freeman going forward, is that he seems like he's someone who's very willing to adapt to what's happening. And he also leans into this stuff from a Notre Dame perspective. Like he finds a way to kind of make it work within the values of the university. He does. I don't feel like he's compromising anything that I feel extremely strongly about. And then you can contrast that to someone like Dabo Swinney, right? I think a reason that Clemson has been falling off a bit is he really has been against the transfer portal. They've had very few transfer recruits coming in, and surprise, surprise, their competition is leaning into it. They're not. They're starting to fall off a little bit.
So let's dive in to the actual transfers. Let's maybe start with the transfers out. 18 players out. That seems like a big number, but if you juxtapose that against 8 players in, 3 more walk-ons, so 11 total, but 8 scholarship players. And I'd also mention it's letting us get bigger recruiting classes out of high schoolers. I think I can look it up, but I think we had about 30 recruits this year out of our high school class. Typically, if you just take 85 scholarships divided by 4, you're talking about 21, 22 players a class. Well, when you have more guys transfer out, it lets you go and take more high school players, try to develop them. And look, we know high school recruits can bust. So if you tell me that you're going to take 30 every year instead of 22, and that 8 or 10 that don't work out are now transferring out, I'd rather that than take 22 and still have 6 not work out. And so I think it's letting us swing the bat more in recruiting, but it does mean kind of net out of the guys coming back. There's more that have left. I'm going to start with the guys that transferred out. And then, Mike, maybe ask you just a couple questions and your thoughts on some of the big headlines. So first off,
Yep.
at the skills positions, Holden stays, tight end, and then a slew of wide receivers: Rico Flores, Braylon James, Tobias Merriweather, and Chris Tyree, also former running back. And then offensive line, Zeke Correll, Carmody, Tanona. I'm not going to rattle off all these names, but on defense, I think the headliners, Nano Safa Mensah, Clarence Lewis, Micah Bell, Ramon Henderson, and Antonio Carter. Those are probably the headliners. And Mike, I'm curious, what jumps out to you as, gosh, that seems like a problem? Like, what do you think is the biggest out of that group? You really wish you still had that guy or that position group that ND fans should most be aware of? Hey, they're not on the roster anymore.
For sure. I think you got to start with the receivers. And look, I think we've done, as we'll get into, we did a great job with the transfer portal this year in terms of getting receivers. That being said, we still lost a few guys who were productive for us last year. And if they had stayed, I think they would have been productive for us this year. So I think you got to start with Rico Flores. Rico Flores was someone who, as a true freshman last year, just showed up ready to play, got better as the year went on. And I think he's someone who would have been an impact player for us this year had he stuck around. So that one definitely hurt. I think Chris Tyree, again, very productive player. That's another one that hurts. If we had him around, we would certainly be finding ways to get him the ball in space. I would say Tobias Merriweather, again, he's like one of those high ceiling guys, but I think we had seen enough of him to, at least in my opinion, I feel like him leaving doesn't really bother me that much. So really, as I'm saying, I think you start with the receivers. And then aside from that, most of these guys, I don't think they were really poised to get a whole lot of playing time. There were a couple guys on defense. So someone like Ramon Henderson and Clarence Lewis, these were guys who were certainly in the depth chart on defense. They were guys who we would play a good amount. So I think our secondary is definitely going to be more than fine. We have a lot of good players there, but if they had stuck around, I guess it would just give us more cushion in case that we have injuries. So, which of course that always happens every football season. But in the scenario where we start getting banged up in the secondary, we could be wishing that some of these guys had stuck around. So yeah, I think from my perspective, again, receivers, and then a couple of these guys on defense, particularly in the secondary.
Yeah, I think receivers is really the name of the game. And I think it's more a quantity question. We'll come back, obviously, to previewing the offense as a whole. And I think this is probably our biggest question mark, maybe on the entire roster, either side of the ball, and an area that we think I don't know if the media is getting it right. Like I don't know if they're fully kind of clicked in to understanding what's going on in that room. Maybe in the same way we are. Maybe we're overly concerned. And I say all of that because we had 8 wide receivers last year or tight ends that had more than 150 yards catching and less than 500, which, by the way, you should be really concerned if your leading wide receiver has 484 yards on the receiver room. 4 of those 8 guys, though, are gone. Tyree led Notre Dame in receiving last year with 484 yards. Um, Rico Flores had 392. Tobias Merriweather had 284. Holden Stays had 176. And the guys that are back, I get it. Jaden Thomas, Jaden Greathouse, Mitchell Evans, Jordan Faison, probably all showing as much, if not way more potential than those 4 guys. But of the 8 ball catchers, they were all kind of clumped around though, like, yeah, one guy has a good game here, one guy has a bad game there. One guy just kind of keeps getting 30 yards a game, but, kind of wide receiver number 3 or 4 territory, not a bona fide number 1. Well, we lost 4 of those 8. And we'll get to who we brought in. We brought in 2 guys that I think are probably upgrades to who we lost, but there's a depth issue. Like there's a depth issue when on top of those 4 guys losing, you also lose Braylon James, who's a big time recruit. You also lose Holden Stays, who really looked like solid number 2 tight end behind Mitch Evans. I just think it's a depth issue that stands out to me that, if we have 1 or 2 injuries in that wide receiver room, I think it's going to be a really big narrative for Notre Dame this year. Outside of that, it's interesting. None of the guys really transferred to notable places. Ramon Henderson going to UCLA, new coaching staff. That seems like a complete start over project after Chip Kelly leaves. Clarence Lewis to Syracuse, pretty interesting, but was getting passed up on the depth chart. Osafa Mensah to TCU. I think he's going to be a starter there. I think he'd have been a starter at ND. But I think, RJ Oben coming in, likely kind of put the writing on the wall for what role Osafa Mensah had. Micah Bell going to Vanderbilt, although he's actually switching from defense to wide receiver. So I stare at the rest, and I just don't think there's another situation outside of wide receiver that stands out. Zeke Correll, probably the one we should also note. Multi-year starter on the offensive line, but it's pretty clear by the end of last year that the coaches were passing him up for Ashton Craig in that center position. And Zeke Correll, an average starter, never really ballooned into that kind of next first round, second round NFL draft pick for Notre Dame offensive line. I'll flip over to the guys that come in. There's 11, 3 are walk-ons, but I'll focus on the others. Riley Leonard, the big headliner at quarterback. Chris Mitchell from FIU, Bo Collins from Clemson, rounding out that wide receiver room. Jaden Harrison, a really interesting, potential starter, potential kick returner. RJ Oben, I think, headlines the defense, best edge rusher in the portal, not just out of Notre Dame, but out of any edge rusher out there. And then Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd, they're going to be battling for either that nickel starting spot or that other safety spot opposite Xavier Watts. And a heck of a leg in Mitch Jeter, South Carolina kicker, actually a member at the same golf club in Salisbury, North Carolina, as my in-laws. So over winter break last year, I was rolling onto the number 1 tee, and Mitch Jeter was putting out on 18. So got some hometown North Carolina connections to Jeter. Hope he's coming in with a big leg. Mike, the obvious one's Riley Leonard. What are your thoughts on QB1 coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Riley Leonard, we'll talk about him more, but I think with him, he's a really high potential prospect. We're familiar with him. We played him last year. He was a tough quarterback to defend when we were playing Duke. Obviously, he got hurt and wasn't quite the same player, but he's someone who comes in, you match him with Denbrock, and I think you have a really intriguing combination there. He's someone who has a strong arm, he has good size, he's very mobile. He can create in a way that someone like Sam Hartman couldn't. So hypothetically, if our receivers are getting off to a bit of a slow start, someone like Riley Leonard is someone who could actually maybe carry the team a little bit more. So I think I know that like our consensus last year was we were very positive on Hartman, potentially putting up really big numbers, but we always qualified it with, hey, look, this is not a first round prospect. This is a guy who best case scenario is probably like a 4th round pick. And as we saw last year, unfortunately, he didn't even live up to that. And don't get me wrong, I love Hartman. Yeah, it was a great ride. The hair was fantastic. But someone like Riley Leonard, there's a scenario here where he's a first round pick, and that's something that we haven't really had in a long time. So, from a transfer portal standpoint, that's really the gem of this transfer class, Riley Leonard. He really gives the hope for this offense. He elevates it to a level that no one else here can.
Completely agree. And I think there's two other ways I could go on what's the headline after Riley Leonard. And I think it's either the wide receivers or it's the safeties. I'm going to start though with the wide receivers because I think this is one where you really have to believe that the four wide receivers and the tight end we lose going out the door needs to be replaced by guys coming back and being better and healthier and more experienced and stronger. I think that's totally true. We'll get to that in our offensive preview. And I think you need to believe in Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins. And Chris Mitchell is the one that I think has been being picked up the most by the coaching staff in interviews, most by players, most kind of the most talked about, like speed and, big time potential. And we heard that a lot in the spring, and it's felt a little quieter in August. And that's always concerning to me. But this is a guy, he had over 1,100 yards on a bad FIU team last year. They went 4-8. Really struggled overall, but had 1,100 yards, big pop guy, over 17 catches a game. And it's FIU, right? So you're looking at the schedule, and it's like, well, who did he play that was, pretty good, and did he still have big games? Against a good Liberty team, 4 catches for 89 yards. Against SEC Arkansas, 6 catches, 157 yards, and a touchdown. His best game of the year. Back in actually it was in late November. He goes and pops against Arkansas for a big time game on the road against an SEC team. So he's shown flashes that, hey, this isn't just against the Maine Bears or North Texas or New Mexico State or UTEP. He did it, albeit in limited data points, against some big time competition. Is he wide receiver number one? I don't know. I think if he's wide receiver number one, it's probably a bit of a problem for our offense. But if he's the second or third guy that's now not getting double teamed and all the focus of the defense, and he's paired with, a Jordan Faison in the slot, Great House, Jaden Thomas taking up more attention, he could be a guy that could get loose as a big time home run threat for ND. So I'm excited about Chris Mitchell. Bo Collins, multi-year starter for Clemson. I think he was a victim of just a very, very underperforming Clemson offense that just never really clicked. But this is a guy that kind of put up 400 or 500 yards every single year for Clemson. So I'm not sitting here saying he's going to go and pop and be number one either. But if I said, hey, would I rather have Bo Collins or Rico Flores? It's probably a toss-up. Would I rather have Bo Collins or Chris Tyree? I think I'd take Bo Collins all day long. And so I think those were two really nice pieces to shore up a problem. I also think there's a very real question going on of like, what's going on with the wide receiver coaches at ND? Chancey Stuckey came in to replace Del Alexander. Del Alexander is this guy that allegedly just couldn't recruit, never really tried recruiting under Brian Kelly and then Marcus Freeman. Chancey Stuckey was supposed to be the solution, and then very quietly gets fired, but like at the same time, all of the guys leave. Like it feels like there's some story there that's just not being discussed, that's not being talked about. And I think this is a step in the right direction for Mike Brown, the new wide receiver coach, coming in to level set that room, stabilize that room, and just get back to producing a Chase Claypool, a Miles Boykin. Like we're not looking for a Belindikoff Award winner. I think we're looking for just a more solid room. And that, I think Chris Mitchell, Bo Collins is a really nice step to complement the rest of the guys there. Mike, what do you think about on defense? We've mentioned RJ Oben, Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd. Talk me through our thoughts on what ND fans should be expecting with those three.
Yeah, I mean, so look, one of the themes in terms of the transfer portal outgoing players was, look, we lost some depth on defense, right? And so if I'm looking at a theme on the other hand for guys coming in, I think we got more than that. So these guys, yes, they addressed the depth needs that we had from the players who transferred out, but they're more. I think they're more important than that. These are guys who could actually be pretty impactful players. So we talked a little bit about RJ Oben, a stalwart on that Duke defensive line. I remember watching that game, And I was impressed with the Duke defensive line. I thought that they were honestly more effective than I was expecting. And a key reason is RJ Oben. So really big piece to add. Like you said, Brett, I wouldn't be surprised if he leads the team in sacks this year. I'm not saying that he necessarily is going to, but I think he's going to be in that conversation. And then Jordan Clark and Rod Hurd. So Clark, I think he's going to fill a pretty critical role at nickel. By all accounts, out of camp, he's been pretty effective in that role. And based on what we've seen from our defense the last couple of years, we'll play a lot of nickel and dime. So you need someone who is effective in that role, and he seems like someone who's going to be able to do that. So I think we've gained a solid starter here. I would say an improvement over what we had leaving, and then moving finally to Rod Hurd. I think he's like I don't know that he's necessarily going to take that a starting spot entirely by himself, but he's certainly going to be in the rotation. It sounds like Schuler is having quite a camp as well. So he'll be getting a lot of playing time at a minimum. I think there might be a bit of a timeshare at that position, but this is a guy who's going to be effective for us. And at a minimum, he's going to add a lot of depth. We'll be able to split some reps around, hopefully keep that position group from wearing out over the course of the year.
Absolutely. So as I think about, kind of where we wrap up this first show here on transfers in and out, the obvious name to know, Riley Leonard. After that, it's about stabilizing the wide receiver room. I think this narrative that we've had massive upgrades to the skill positions at wide receiver, I think is probably a bit overhyped. I think it's something ND fans really got to be watching early in the season of that wide receiver room. Still a big question, but feels like the right steps to stabilize, maybe not upgrade. And then defense, some really thoughtful pieces. I think RJ Oben, we should have a high expectations for, similar to Jean-Baptiste last year. I think in the secondary, in the very least, adding depth, potentially seeing a guy pop and get into the starter role at some combination of nickel safety. Certainly, though, heavy role players and depth in the case of injury. That's the news on Notre Dame. That's the news on who's in and out of the roster from a transfer perspective. We'll be back on our next show to dive into the offense.